Welcome back to This Is Fine, the podcast where we make sure your tech troubles are nothing more than a little humor and a little know-how can't fix. I'm your host, Matt Treiner, the CEO of Hunter Strategy, here to dive into the wild world of tech and cybersecurity, especially in the government. Today, we're unraveling the various points around monolithic, modulithic, and microservices architecture patterns with our guest Greg Vanore, our Director of Software Engineering, and Scott Hiland, the Director of Platform Engineering, both from here at Hunter Strategy. As always, expect some laughs if you're a nerd, some insights if you care, and maybe a few surprises as we break down these terms and these approaches. So let's jump right in. What are the key differences between monolithic, modulithic, and microservices architectures? Just to kind of level set, because I think there's at least one person listening, like my dad, who has no idea what we're talking about. So let's break this down for somebody who's worked in software for many, many years and did it from a completely sales standpoint and does not necessarily know what we're talking about when we refer to these architecture patterns. So who wants to take that one?
It's kind of a question of how big of a team you're running, I think, like how large of a software delivery you're kind of running. Because if you wanted a sports analogy, it might be the difference between like the very small kids where there's only like five of them on the field at a time, on each team. That's going to be where, maybe a little bit more monolithic. Yeah. Everything can be controlled and managed in a small place.
So monolithic is like an oil tanker, one big hold and it's filled with oil. Modulithic is like a modern shipping container where you have all the different containers stacked up on top of it, right? But you're still shipping it in one boat. And microservices are Somali pirates.
I would say maybe microservices are like somebody tried to stack all the boxes instead of the actual containers.
I just want to point out the double entendre of containers that was able to be used in this, and I think that was excellent. Even though not everyone will necessarily appreciate that, I did, Greg, and that was excellent. Okay. But yeah, I didn't see the Somali pirate thing coming, so I also think that's pretty good.
I don't have a shipping analogy for microservices. That's the problem.
I mean, it would. I think it's the equivalent of one of those boat parades, but using it for shipping purposes, right? As opposed to everybody being in a boat because we're all having fun and drinking beers on the water. It's everybody has to bring a single box in that ridiculous unorchestrated thing that is. It's actually not a terrible analogy though, if you think about it, because in a boat parade, typically, although there have been some mistakes, much like with microservices, general logical constraints keep these boats from hitting each other, right? You've got line of sight, you've got general good rules of conduct, you have some general principles, and these boats don't end up sinking each other in the process. Much like microservices distributed among teams with patterns and good approaches. Occasionally, somebody has a little too much to drink and there is a boating accident, which definitely happens in microservice architectures that don't adhere to these norms. So I actually think we stumbled on a somewhat reasonable analogy here.
It's not the worst if you imagine a microservice as like a shipping boat that can only take a single container, because one of the problems with microservices and the reason why there's like a pushback against them is paying the costs of building a whole service for one small thing. Like you have to know that what you're doing. You have to maintain your engine. You have to fuel your boat. You have to staff it with a crew. You have to navigate, all that stuff, like observability, traceability, debugging, reliability concerns, scaling. Like it's all on that one microservice. Whereas in the traditional monolith or modulith, you're going to pay those external costs once, not per component. So
I don't disagree with that. I would also like pull back and think about complexity. Like size and complexity is another thing that plays into this in a big way.
Right.
And if we're going to talk about microservices, you can't ignore the fact that Kubernetes wouldn't exist if microservices hadn't become a thing. In order to service those layers of abstraction in an automated and consistent way, right? So like that is that extra overhead you were talking about on a per microservice basis.
Yep.
And sometimes you'll find an organization where they have this over normalized approach where they want to go and like, I want everything to be this reusable chunk. And architecturally that can work, but you got to know when to pull back and say, what is my component microservice? Like, do I care that I split out the put from the get from the update,
So in the very early days of microservices, when it was in the peak hype cycle, I was on Reddit somewhere and I saw some guy asking about, or gal, we don't know, asking what are microservices, and he was getting this explanation, and then got the whole spiel from the whole thread of conversation, and then he went off and said, "Oh, I'm so psyched! I'm gonna go deploy my first microservice. I think what I'm gonna do is make a service that analyzes text to see if it matches a regex." And immediately you get into like, okay, there's obviously too small, right? There's obviously too small. And a lot of the community is saying if you come from a big ball of wax monolith background, there's obviously too big. So, part of the problem here is the name micro. It's more just like figuring out a proper solution for your problem, right? Like some parts of your solution may need to independently scale, some don't. And it's going to be all about your big N and your usage patterns and your business domain and what needs to be redundant and reliable and dynamically scaling and what you can schedule and do in batches, off hours.
Whoa, Greg, you're talking about approaching your stakeholders and talking to the business about technical things. And this is not something that should happen in any modern organization.
Well, yeah. Well, and the reality is that the whole Modulithic microservice discussion is all about your business at the end of the day. It's not a technical decision, in my opinion.
Well, and let's dig into that for a second, because I think that that's actually kind of the important point here that we stumbled on pretty early, but I think it's one to underline, right? Is you talked about things that need to scale, things that don't, and kind of it's hard for the business, especially those that are not used to building software and even ones that are used to building it, but DoD especially just loves to do this. Well, you build it and then you guys maintain it. And how do the people that build it know the usage patterns if it doesn't get used until it's, quote, in maintenance mode? So you end up with these really interesting design discussions with sometimes, honestly, and I'm the first to make fun of, bad product ownership in all forms. But a lot of times these are solid product owners that just have a shoebox around their head called RDT&E. And that's all they're allowed to think about. And so either they go to the one extreme of, well, we have no idea, so everything needs to scale independently, just in case. And then your regex guy gets a gold star. And then you have other ones that are kind of like, I think on the worst side of that spectrum, it's kind of like, I don't know, you figure it out. And then you have a developer that's like, it's hard to say they're going out of scope because there is no scope definitionally in that discussion. And that creates kind of a really set of perverse incentives for what I like to call resume-driven development, which is where people start doing things that are just because it's cool and because I want to learn how to do that. And it's not to say that I believe that anybody that's putting out a 5-year contract for software developers need to pay a little bit of that tax of letting your developers learn things that they think are interesting. That's just the tax of owning custom software. And I think that that's a very reasonable thing for a totally different topic of podcasts. But like getting past the fact that that's a reasonable amount of time, doing that intentionally makes a lot of sense. Doing that because we lack the requirements, scope discussion, or understanding of production utilization. So we substituted that with whatever the developers told them was good is inherently problematic. And I don't think that this gets discussed enough when people, I'm guilty of it. I write RFPs talking about how great our microservices are all the time. because or I write responses to, because the RFP says we need us some microservices, and that's what the customer is asking for, and the customer can buy this service from several 100,000 vendors. So I want them to pick us. So I tell them that we can do what they say. And it's not that we can't, it's just that nobody appreciates that gap bridging discussion of like, okay, but how much of it? Like, yeah, you want a burger. Great. I can give you a burger. Do you want like a 700 patty burger in the event that you are just trying to demonstrate that In-N-Out can put as many patties in a burger as possible? Or do you want 3 because you're hungry, or 1 because you're not that hungry, right? Like, these are all reasonable answers to the lack of scope short order cook analogy. So one of the things that I guess we should try to get to here is, how do we help that well-meaning product owner with an RDT&E shoebox on their head that doesn't know how to ask the right questions or make the right assumptions, answer the question of the developers that aren't, high enough level thinkers, good developers that don't want to sit here talking about business things, that just reasonably ask, okay, so what's, because it is becoming more common to have that discussion of how micro should my microservices be. That's the modular services discussion that thankfully, like, people have published about and is part of the Zeitgeist of how you should do things now. But how the developers don't know how to elicit that business requirement, or many don't. Product owners are wearing a shoebox for a hat. How do we give the shoebox wearing product owner a fighting chance?
If you don't mind me talking some more, Scott, I would suggest that you follow in the footsteps of Robert McNamara, I think was his name. I saw a documentary many years ago called The Fog of War. It's an excellent documentary. And what he said and how he drove his decisions, and I know he's a controversial dude, okay? So I'm not, endorsing everything that he did. But what he said, get the data. And I think that's where you start. You go to your product owner, and if you're lucky enough to be on a contract where they haven't made all these decisions and you're just getting paid to execute bad decisions, and you have some ability to discuss with the person that you're working with and maybe sway them to make better decisions, you start without not rewriting the old service into a new service, but you start modifying the old service to collect telemetry so that you can say these features are used the most frequently and these features are used the least frequently. And once you have the data, you can then start having discussions about this thing that you thought was important, that was going to be very expensive for us to rewrite. No one uses. We don't even need to port it. It had 0 users in the last 3 months, for example. And you can also start on the most frequent stuff instead of not knowing that information. It's also a way that you might be able to start cluing into the clunky aspects of, because users are clever and oftentimes they work around bad parts of systems, and you might be able to glean what are the workarounds that users are doing. Like, are they not doing something but doing something unexpected? So there are techniques for that. Like, if you can't use something on the internet, you can use open telemetry, for example. So there's tools that would allow you to basically get data, have a telemetry platform, even if you're not on the internet and you're on some internet. But even before that, you can probably start with scoping and scaling. Like, we saw some proposals roll through, Matt, where they said that they have just a few hundred users and not more than 10 to 20 concurrent users for a system that they wanted totally modernized. And why on earth would you go to a microservice backend with like an edge compute CDN cached JavaScript front end for 20 concurrent users? I could run that on a Raspberry Pi, right?
Yeah. So I think there's value in the data,
Yep.
but because you are ultimately going to have to sell to them. So, hey, Matt's dad.
Yeah.
You need to scare the piss out of them about the risk of not
Yeah.
considering that their system is a living thing until it is retired. So One of the examples there would be deprecation. And if you are building on a modern framework, if you're building on any framework, things are going to age out. Things are going to be deprecated. And if you have security concerns about that, you need to make sure that you're on top of your deprecation approach.
Yeah.
And that means pull the RDT&E shoebox off your head and think about what O&M maintenance, like real maintenance of the code, looks like. Not just upgrading Tomcat, but upgrading struts so that next year you're able to tell the folks that, hey, yeah, I meet my STIGs because I have a maintenance developer that knows how to go and fix these monoliths, moduliths, microservices at the scale needed in order to keep us secure. Scare the piss out of them. They need to hear it. They need to know, because this is one of the biggest risks that they incur when they consider what approach to follow. If you've got 100 different implementations of struts tags in your microservices versus in a modulith or in a monolith, then you're going to have a harder time approaching that. And I know that I'm using an example from recent memory, but it's a very real thing. There are a lot of folks who were hit with a big security vulnerability in struts recently, having to do with file uploads, and they're having to answer the mail on that right now. And there are no struts developers. How are you going to approach that? And the answer is, if you are a good product owner, then you expect the scale and the maintenance as part of keeping your system alive.
I just think these are two things I want to drive home, because I think you both made very coupled but very distinct points, right? Which is, on Greg's side, you did talk about data, but what I heard at the beginning was kind of like, well, if you don't have the data, then what do you think people are going to use the most? Like, definitely reprioritize with the data, but just that initial taking off that RDT&E shoebox and thinking about the user community and thinking like, well, logically, this is the mission. We're shipping eggs, so our egg inventory service is probably gonna be hit a lot, certainly a lot more than our, internal tool that determines the current status of the packaging for recycling purposes that was part of our egg shipping application, right? So like, there are some logical things that you could do. You back those with data, you back those with tooling, you bake that data into your data collection into your software design and your platform design, because I think there's a little bit of both there. And then, to Scott's point, you need to build a realistic software maintenance plan. And a software maintenance plan is, and I do think that you're absolutely right about needing to scare people into this, because if you already understand it, right? If that's somebody who's going to get mad at you for quote unquote using fear tactics, then they're already doing it, because there's really no good argument against this. And so you can apologize to that person the 1 out of 10 times that happens among most environments, and say, yep, sorry, I thought you were in the 90% of people that don't think of maintenance this way. Never again. And for the other 9 of them, you're providing a really important education, because I cannot tell, there is no STIG for that outside of ASD, right? There is no, I cannot tell you how many applications where people are like, well, we did all the STIG checks, and I'm like, your STIG check is Red Hat. And they're like, yep, and it all passed. And I'm just kind of like, all right. And and it was a very early discussion with somebody who got very into software. He was just very junior in his career, but they were in an intelligence agency just applying this vanilla Red Hat STIG to everything, and just so worried about automation of how do we make the STIG happen and this and that. And I remember just having a status meeting. This is early in Hunter days. There was a subcontract to a large company that was running the cybersecurity program. And I was like, but what's running on the Red Hat? And he's like, what do you mean? And I was just like, but the software, is it a X Windows Java application with Swing? Like what could it possibly be that you wouldn't also have like a Tomcat Stig or a web server SRG or something else, because they were just so laser focused on the OS. And that's just the light bulb moment on that Teams call where he was like, right, the software is in the computer. it was really quite something, because again, it was just very junior. He was totally on board with fixing this problem, but he only knew what he was trained. And the culture of this agency was, we automate everything. We can go from step 4 to step 5 in RMF in a day, so we're the fastest out there doing it. But the quality of assessment was garbage, and the catalog and the information in the package was, I don't want to say bad, but just a subset of reality, right? Like ignoring, like what they did well, but they weren't doing most of the things you need to do.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Greg.
Oh, I was just going to say, we had a definition of monolithic and modulithic for non-technical people, but can we kind of get into what the actual distinction of monolithic and modulithic are, at least theoretically, supposed to be at a more technical level?
Sure, because I think that'll actually dovetail into the follow-on I was going to ask anyway, so go for it.
Yeah, we haven't actually laid this out yet, that is, monolith and modulithic are kind of the same thing. They're both a monolithic application, but the monolith is sort of a derogatory term these days, meaning when you just have everything thrown in one big ball of wax, software architecture-wise. Whereas a modulith, in theory, is supposed to be designed more like pluggable shipping containers, but you don't have to ship each one as a service. They're in your project. Sort of, you have a coherent service concept, and you could theoretically pull those out into separately scalable microservices if you determine that you need to, or on demand. But you don't have to pay the microservice cost up front. You just kind of like are in preparation for pulling microservices out. And so that could mean, for example, like creating a gRPC IDL where you define your service requests and responses, you generate the interfaces. Maybe inside your monolithic application, you're calling the interfaces that you generate, but you're not actually going over a network proxy, for example. But then you're ready to immediately turn that into an event-based gRPC call to some remote service the moment that you decide, hey, the service needs to be scaled and managed independently, or is complex enough that another team should take it over and you should cooperate through the interface. And so one way to put it, if you're familiar with normal development techniques for, I don't know, say like standard .NET or Java, traditionally in a monolith, you might have a package for like model, and all of your data models are in there, and a package for service, and all of your service interfaces are in there. But in a monolithic architecture, you just kind of flip the script on that, and you're going to have a package for feature that has model and service package in it, and then feature B, model and service package. I mean, more than that, but you're not doing one package tree. You're kind of doing a package tree for all of the independent cooperating features and services. And no, I am not advocating for hexagonal architecture.
You can also get some of the same benefits that you might get out of a microservices architecture and a monolith by doing smart things, like you said, of putting your models in a specific place. Or if you've got areas that are going to be coupled relatively tightly, you can decouple them intelligently in the place where it makes the most sense. So the example I would give for that is what we're currently doing on one of our clients, which is an API specification that's built to the business needs into the existing legacy system. And then you have the build of that automated using automated tooling so that your objects get generated automatically. Code generators, this is all open API, Swagger-ish type stuff.
Yep.
Code's generated already, and then you build the logic in order to turn that into something useful for the business. In a modulith, that means that from a pull, commit, build, synchronization, integration perspective, if you're building everything based off of your API spec, then it makes a lot of sense to say, but keep my JavaScript components over here and keep my Java components over here. It's just a lot more sensible than it is to go and say, all right, we have one spec, sure, but it's all broken down into these microservices individually, which has a tendency from a business perspective to pull you down away from the business needs. You find yourself staring, at that one tree. Your nose is pressed right up against the tree, and then there's a mile of forest on either side of you. You can see nothing other than the bark on that one tree.
I feel like a lot of people who start with a microservice architecture before they know they need it ultimately end up in a distributed monolith anyway.
Well, that was the follow-up I was going to ask. Is people talk about creating this full microservices transition, and I guess, and I've never, I'm not just playing dumb host here, although I'm pretty dumb. I've never really thought about it before now, but I don't know. Is there a point of that? Is that a thing that you should ever really do? And it's not to say that you can't have individual microservices. It's not to say that microservices are a bad idea inherently, because I think we all know that they're not. But I think that the idea that we need to target this pattern in a holistic way and there can be no exceptions to it is kind of inherently a fallacy, unless there's some tech debt in like a legacy monolith modulith thing that like it's like such a small percentage of the architecture that like, yeah, sure, finish it, right?
Okay.
Like that's I get that, but like it seems like that as a programmatic goal is inherently flawed.
So, right, as a programmatic goal, my question to someone who wants to institute a policy like that is, what's the size limit for a service before you have to split it into more services?
Yeah, that's solid. That's solid. And then two, I was talking about microservices and Kubernetes a minute ago. What part of your architecture and your system and your software development process, or what parts of developing these features into production, are you trying to commoditize? And so I would say if you are working in a purely microservices architecture and you weren't doing a lot of code generation by plugins and stuff, it might make sense to say, hey, we're going microservices because what I've got is a bunch of junior developers who are really good at implementing very simple bits of logic. And I've got one or two mid-senior developers who are excellent at tying those together. So it comes back to the whole business question, like, what is the organization that you're running? How have you commoditized things in your organization? And then, like, at what abstraction layers of your feature delivery process are you attending to your technical debt and your toil reduction battles? Because if you don't have a team that can support whatever happens down here and here, then you are never going to get what you want from a return on investment perspective. Like, you'll never get a good outcome if you're not paying attention to those things.
Of course, the platform guy says you need a platform team. Of course. We just can bingo, I win. But yeah, no, I was going to say that's the other thing, is that a lot of times microservices was not invented to solve technical problems. It was invented to solve organizational problems. Well, okay, it can solve some technical problems.
It was trumpeted very loudly when Mr. Bezos sent a memo saying, you will implement services across this organization or you will not be here anymore, right, so that anyone else can use those same services. If you remember the Google engineer rant from 15 years ago discussing it, very good example. And it drove a lot of uptake of microservices and, yes, ultimately of people buying containerized
I've been programming
products
since the 90s, and I remember the days of having gigantic development teams on monolithic applications where your customer comes in and says, I need to change the color of a button. And some poor sap has to tell them, well, that's going to take, 6 months, because there's so much intertangled mess of everybody working in the same pool of things. And it's like, if you change the color of a button, I have to rerun all the regression tests again to make sure nothing in the monolith broke. And it's like, well, why do you have to test the warehouse inventory management portion of the code just because you changed the color of the button on the accounting report view? And it's like, well, because the code changed, and if we break the inventory process, the inventory system, the business stops.
Because Fred Brooks was right.
So there's legitimate reasons here for breaking things apart. And the tools are better now than they ever have been back in the, it's called service-oriented architecture in the late 90s and early 2000s, right? There just wasn't this obsession about how big should those services be, which, is still up for debate today, even though we are now using fun words like microservice everywhere.
Artisanal XML.
Yes. I don't always develop, but when I do, I put my flannels and suspendies on. But, getting back to that earlier point of conversation about the engineers who want to do cool stuff because they're bored and they have their box hat, shoebox hat around research and development. We don't have a lot of data in our industry. Not a lot of organizations share what worked well or what didn't go well for them. And there's a lot of hype-driven development, unfortunately. And you see success from organizations that have needs. Like if you are a social media company and someone posts something and it goes viral, you're making your money off of ad impressions on people viewing that page. And if you get your link added to Facebook or Reddit or Slashdot, for those old enough to remember that, and suddenly you get this flood of traffic, you have this huge spike. If you can't handle that, you've lost money. That's a big deal. And that's a totally different architecture than if you are a business and you want a reliable business process and you basically have like a constant workload, right? So the issue is that most of what we pay attention to for hype are startups that are trying to get attention. They want to have low capital costs when they're operating because they have no budget. So they want to be able to scale their infrastructure to zero. And if they do start gaining success, they want to be able to handle it and not capture any of those customers that come to them. So again, it's a business question, right? And that really pushes those people into cloud systems and microservice architectures because those are kind of designed around handling those particular business needs. So now you're the government and all the hype is around this stuff, but yet you're the Bureau of Labor Statistics and you have, 2,000 employees and you have to crunch certain amounts of numbers and run certain reports every year. And you have a certain fixed amount of data that you operate on. Do you need dynamically scaling microservices to handle that? Or do you need, 4 server blades?
Yeah.
So one thing I did want to just chuck in the mix, because you mentioned tooling. How does our industries adopt? And I almost made a joke about this when you talked about making a bit, never talking to stakeholders. And why would you do that? My answer or my comment was going to be, well, in DevSecOps, we just do things distributed among people asynchronously. So there are no stakeholders. It's all just automated pipelines. But in a serious tone, like how does the evolution of the tooling of DevOps that we kind of colloquially call DevOps affect these patterns and these choices? Because my first thought when I was kind of just waiting on the question was like, well, it's never been easier to remove a service from a monolith and deploy it as a microservice thanks to having pipelines and patterns. It's also never been easier to overly chop up your services so finely that they're stupid thanks to DevOps and pipelines and patterns.
Yeah.
So like, is it just an accelerant that can be used for good or evil? Is there some inherent good in it? Did it come from a good place? A good reference on Kubernetes as never being needed if not for the independent scale of microservices. So I'm curious what you guys think in kind of tying that those relationships together between the platform and the pattern.
So platform is exactly where we're going to go, right? Right now, platform engineering, in the buzziest sense of the Gartner Magic Quadrant sense of the word, is about installing Backstage. That's it. If you install Backstage, you are a platform engineer with no addressing of the underlying business questions that might drive you to sensibly choose something to help build out these patterns. As always, it's a question of your teams, your architecture, your leadership. Like, who's making the decision? Are they making a business decision? Do they have the savvy? Do they have the data they need in order to make that business decision? And then do they have the team to implement it? I've got charter, I've got agency, I've got everything I need, except I don't have enough people on my team to go. And if I do need backstage to go and stand it up, if you are not running a big, complex organization with massive numbers of Kubernetes clusters, you don't need backstage. You need decent DevSecOps workflows, whether they are implemented in GitLab CI or something else. You just need something that can take, in a scripted way, your code, build it, test it, integration test it, maybe some security scanning of some variety in there, and then put it where it needs to go based on tags, labels, what the branch it came out of. And that's it. That's it. Like, ultimately, most build pipelines, if you boil them all the way down to what they do, most build pipelines are less than 30 lines of bash. And that's the way it should be. And all that you should tell your developers about that is make sure your environment is as close as possible to what production and test look like, so that when you tell me the feature works, we can be reasonably assured that it does. That's a platform. 20 lines of bash can be a platform. Unless you really want that platform engineer bullet on your resume, or you want successful platform director on your resume and you have some other underlying reason. Again, scale
You're
is
saying you can be a platform engineer without deploying a single Kubernetes?
Yeah, no, you have to deploy at least one Kubernetes. Just one. Just the one.
Well, so Scott, that's very interesting because that's kind of old school, right? Because if we're going to wear our RDT&E shoebox hat and do fad-driven development, another thing that we also need to do is fire all of our testers and not have any of that, and instead do things like blue-green, A/B, canary testing type stuff where we just shunt some of the user traffic to the new instance. Now, I was joking about firing the testers, even though that is the trend, because I think that is a useful technique, right? And if you have a monolith, and we were kind of talking earlier about monolith to modernization, modern transitions, that's a technique you could use in your legacy monolith. You implement your telemetry, you create a service that's the new modern version of the service, and maybe 10% of your users, you can shunt them over to the new service and gradually grow the new service to verify that it's doing what it's supposed to do. And, always start with a read only, right? That's a good one too. But there's all these different techniques have a role. And I don't know if I would be too prescriptive about, your build does your dev test, integration test, deploy, and then be real specific about crafting a dev environment, because then you're getting into like well-architected framework and different kinds of development models where you spool up an exact copy of the system for a developer to test on so that you can just delete the whole thing. Like that's some cool stuff that you can do in the cloud. So you could have complicated architectures and still test them in the exact same deployment configuration as they are in production. Whereas, in the old school days, because Matt was asking if it's an accelerant or not, you wouldn't have that. You'd have crusty shared servers, or you'd spool up like a VM on your own development machine. So trying to get back to that tools question, I think the tools that we have now really are a lot better. You have your gRPC and tRPC. Of course, there was stuff before like Corba, but like it was so awful. You'd never wanted to use it. So the tools are actually good now for things like doing service definitions. And you have like your Podman desktop and kind for local Kubernetes clusters. Woe be to you if you're, but it's there. It's available to you. And then there's sort of, so I like to call Kubernetes like a cloud operating system as a joke, because it really does try to abstract away the things that you would rely on your operating system, networking and disk storage and memory and CPU. And it's just like an abstraction layer, as awful as it is for what it does. But then recently I've been seeing toolkits like Dapper, that DAPR stuff, that they're like microservice abstraction toolkits, microservice abstraction layers where like you need observability. Well, just, call this layer here, and then when it gets deployed, you kind of plug in one of your compatible observability tools. And then in that sense, they're enabling local development of backend services that don't require you to go to your cloud. And I'm kind of meandering, but you get the idea.
Well, and I want to tag on, when I talk about the 20 lines, 30 lines, 100 lines of bash,
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily talking about it running just locally. Like, it could be something that pushes the test definition along with an artifact up to an ECS container and
Right.
runs it in a context that the developer has
Sure.
what is equivalent to production, access. My point being, we will go, in order to fluff out the resume, we will go and build out a bunch of unnecessary tooling.
Oh, yeah.
When the best approach for return on investment anyway, or at least for user outcomes, would be the 20, 30, 100 lines of bash. Like, just many organizations still haven't nailed it down. How do I get this code into production? Write it down. Make it a script. Run it. Sorry, you don't need Backstage.
No. Well, I was not making that case. But
This podcast sponsored by Backstage.
yeah, this podcast sponsored by GNU, right? All you need is bash.
So we're coming up on time, but I do want to kind of touch on a couple points and give you guys a second to wrap up, because I think that we've covered a lot of really good areas, which is to say, one, microservices are shit. You should never do them. No, I'm kidding. But it's like anything else, the best application of technology tooling is to solve business problems. And I think that that's the theme that we kind of kept coming back to.
That's what they pay us to do in reality.
Well, that's I think the point I was making is that I think that it's our industry so often forgets that what we're being paid to do is solve business problems. And the bigger the teams are, the hungrier the program manager is to expanding their team, the hungrier the product owner is at getting more resources for their team. It's not to say that those aren't important qualities, because sometimes you legitimately, I've been on overstaffed projects as often as I've been on understaffed projects, right? And so I get that it's easy to call everyone stupid, but it's hard to actually have that discussion and get to a shared mindset of what is the business value and what is everybody doing. And microservices are a great goal in many cases if applied to the business need of the system that they are serving, right? DevOps using... So, I've never used Backstage, but DevOps using incredibly expensive tools like, I don't know, Cloud Foundry are not bad for what they do. They're perfectly good things, but like it gets to a place where people are just like, but what I really need is Cloud Foundry. And I'm like, well, why do you need Cloud Foundry? Like, why do you need it more than you just need Kubernetes or more than you just need ECS, right? And if you're an Amazon person, and then the answer is like, because it's cool, or like because, and that's like the developer answer. The product owner answer is like, because I need strength and resilience. And I'm like, these are not business requirements. Like, these are like features that might get attached to a business requirement. Yeah. And I think that that's kind of the point. And I really hope that if anybody listening to this learns anything, is that if you can't answer those questions, you should learn how, if you're a product owner. And if you don't know how to ask those questions, or when I say, I'm not even trying to be flip, like you should collaborate with your peers that you think have good answers about their products, right? You should figure out how to answer that in your environment. And then you should red team yourself and say, a nosy pain in the ass developer is going to challenge my answers. How do I answer them? Right? I think that that's something every product owner could do. Every dev lead needs to figure out, how do they ask the questions more softly and with these, the Somali pirates analogy is a good one for an SES. Right? Like it's not a perfect one, but it's a good one if you're trying to explain to somebody, hey, I'm trying to help you save money. I'm trying to help you be more efficient. Can you please lend me the focus part of your brain, which scientists say is like 2 to 3 hours a day of like people's available time? Give me 30 minutes to an hour of that so we can solve some big problems, but I can't do that without your input. And that's on us as industry to learn how to earn that attention, because it is earned. Nobody owes it to us, even if they're paying us. Nobody owes it to us, even if they're the steward of tax dollars. And I'm not saying earning it in the sense of like how I earn my money. I'm saying that's a physiological thing. If you don't earn somebody's attention, you don't get it. And so that's what we as industry need to figure out how to do better. Analogies are great. Empathy is great. Like lots of these are not technical skills that you need to learn how to earn people's attention.
And learn economic terms, because, you know, like what you're discussing, you're making me really think about a project that I've recently come across that, you know, they have very minimal needs for some of the services that they're running. And they've got a full Kubernetes up and they're managing the Kubernetes, and it's tons of work for them and tons of cost as well to just run a single node of a single service. And, you know, we recently asked the question, why didn't you just basically put this in ECS? Because that's all you needed.
Right.
You know, and you didn't need to spool up a whole Kubernetes cluster and then a rancher to manage it. and
Well,
you know, and let me just get into, sometimes the question is, it comes down to, it's like, it's not just the physical cost of running the Kubernetes, it's the opportunity cost of people on the team could be doing other things versus managing the Kubernetes. So it's a really important concept.
Paying down the tech debt, reducing the toil. So if you're talking about going all in on microservices, or if anybody is still talking about that, I just want to point out that making decisions based on ideology is never effective in business over the long haul. You will find yourself in a hole. But many times that person who has made that decision or has forced that decision and pushed it has moved on elsewhere to try to push the same ideology somewhere, in many cases without any outcome, like any positive outcome to show for it. And like the flip side of what you were talking about with biz solutions, Matt, is that you can have a business solution that solves all of the problems that you have listed that need to be solved, that creates many more. And Kubernetes is an excellent example of that. It is there. It solves the problem. Hey, we no longer have to manage these workloads independently. We have things that do it for us. That's fantastic. But you've also created a massive amount of sustainment effort in order to keep that alive. And many organizations, they don't think in that way. Like you were saying earlier about RDT&E versus O&M, they think that this system is static when it's done. No system is done until it's retired, until there is not a single screw left in that server room.
That's an attitude that a lot of non-technical people don't understand. And we see even today in commercial and in government contracting, you know, you get into that concept of, I'm going to buy some time from this agency to spearhead development, and then it's done. No.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time and insights. Fun as always. Shout out to my dad. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your day. This has been another episode of This Is Fine.